Welcome to the Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. This week's author with a new book is Tim Samuels. His book is Future Man: How to Evolve and Thrive in the Age of Trump, Mansplaining, and Me Too. So, as you can tell by the title, this is a fairly controversial book in terms of the timing of talking about men's issues when maybe we should just shut up and listen. So that's how we begin. We talk about that and why he came to write this book and the reasons for it. And I think it's fair. I think it's very fair in terms of how he deals with a lot of these issues. So we go through pretty much all the major topics of current events regarding and surrounding the Me Too movement and Trump. And then we cover a lot of other related topics. So my guest here, Tim Samuels, just to read his bio, is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, broadcaster, and journalist. Tim has been a leading name on the BBC for many years. He now also appears as a global correspondent on the National Geographic Channel. Tim's films have won the top UK and international honors, including Best Documentary at the World Television Festival and 3 Royal Television Society awards. He's written for the New York Times, Guardian, and GQ. Tim's acclaimed new podcast, All Hail Kale, was the #1 new BBC podcast according to the London Evening Standard. We talk about that, by the way. It's about nutrition and diet and what we should be eating. And so we get into the whole realm of how much protein you should eat, eggs okay, alcohol, things like that. Let's see. Future Man, when it was originally published in England, was titled Who Stole My Spear? It was an Amazon bestseller there. Born in Manchester, England, Tim now lives in London, but works between the UK and the US. Visit his website at www.tim-samuels, SAMUELS.com. And as usual, if you enjoy the podcast, please support it at skeptic.com/donate or at Patreon. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, so your donations are tax deductible, and we depend on them to continue our mission of science education. Thanks for listening. Tim Samuels, thanks for coming on the show. Your new book is Future Man: How to Evolve and Thrive in the Age of Trump, Mansplaining, and Me Too. #MeToo. The original UK version was Who Stole My Spear?
Yes.
Which I like that title. Did it have a different subtitle? Obviously, because you guys don't worry about the age of Trump in the UK quite as much as we do, I suppose.
Well, I don't know. We kind of, you catch a cold and,
Oh, right.
we catch the flu over here. I think it was just called something generic about how to be a man in the 21st century. And then as I finished it, Trump, Brexit, and Me Too all happened. So it sort of felt like it needed a little bit of updating. Though
Yeah.
I kind of foresaw the populist rise.
Well, I think I want to say good timing on the book, but I don't know. There's a lot of people, a lot of women, and a lot of woke social justice men who feel like it's time for you men to shut the fuck up and listen. You guys have been talking for 10,000 years and running the show. Step aside and let the women have their say. And I'm mildly sympathetic to that in the sense that historically speaking, that's true. So I was glad to see you listen to you listed 7 reasons not to write this book.
Yeah.
So let's just rattle those off here just so we acknowledge that, we're not saying everything is great for women now and men are oppressed. 1, women aged 25 to 34 earn 89 cents for every dollar men of the same age group are paid. 2, women make up only 22% of board directors of Fortune 500 companies. 3, an estimated 100 to 140 million girls and women around the world have undergone genital mutilation. 4, women make up less than 8% of the world's heads of government. 5, in the U.S., women are not legally defined as persons until 1875. 6, in Yemen, a wife must obey her husband and not leave home without his permission. And 7, in the UAE, a man has the right to physically discipline his wife, and if he does not leave as long as he doesn't leave physical marks. Okay. So, these are real issues that still go on. There's still a glass ceiling in a lot of corporations. Bill Gates was just tweeting the other day about, making inroads using his nonprofit to help women catch up and that we have a ways to go. I think he said something like, at the current rate, it's going to take 220 years to achieve equality. So we need to, speed things up. Okay, so given that reality, although I on the first point, women, the so-called income gap between men and women, we should acknowledge that that's at least disputed. I'm not sure where you're getting 89 cents on the dollar. Maybe that's a UK figure. In the United States, it's often 77 cents on the dollar. But people like Christina Hoff Sommers say, well, that depends on how the numbers are calculated. Because if women are working fewer hours because they have childcare duties or they take different career paths, that better enables them to, be mothers or whatever, or even within professions, like in the medical profession, you can have a male medical doctor and a female medical doctor. But if the female goes into pediatrics and the male goes into plastic surgery and he's working in Hollywood, he's going to make a lot more money than she's going to make and so on. So with all those adjustments, I think she thinks it's more like 90 cents on the dollar or something, 95 cents on the dollar, something like that.
I mean, I think what I found in the UK is, I'd have to check, but as I recall, when you're comparing men and women in full-time employment, women essentially out-earn guys in their 20s and 30s, and what happens is childcare. So the penalty that kicks in really is around childcare. So that's something that, as a society, we haven't quite got our heads around. But this is nuanced and it's messy. And so often gender is presented as this zero-sum game that, what you're positing at the top is, well, now it's time for guys to lose. Well, it doesn't have to be.
Right.
And when women lose, guys lose and vice versa. So I guess what I'm saying at the moment is this isn't about taking something from women. This isn't zero-sum. This is about saying, actually, a lot of guys are having a really tough time at the moment. And this might be your son, this might be your brother, this might be your husband. These are people in your life. And unless we take what's going on with these guys seriously, this is going to impact all of us. This is going to drive radical politics. This will mean that less action is taken on climate change. This will drive more mass shootings. So even if you're coming at this from a kind of very selfish point of view, you probably don't want a society full of angry, disenfranchised men, because it's more likely to be radical right-wing, give less of a toss about the environment, have more mass shootings and higher incarceration levels. So I think it's quite important to kind of look beyond the zero sum and say, actually, let's treat men and women as humans, as individuals, rather than, well, one's got to win for one to lose, and it's your turn to lose because you've had it great since we took up farming 10,000 years ago. By the way, we were gender equal when we were cavemen and women.
Right.
Farming, like so many things, screwed us.
Yeah. No, that's a super important point. It's not a zero-sum game. I mean, this is often the case when you read about income inequality, which is a real issue that has to be addressed. But first of all, it's not like because Elon Musk makes 400 times, or probably more like 4,000 times more than I make, whatever it is, it's huge. But why does that hurt me? I mean, I'm just doing my thing and I make a living, and it's not like he's taking something out of my pocket. I don't have to buy his cars or the same thing with Bill Gates, and so on. It's not, why is it zero sum? But there is kind of an instinctive sense we have, and I think this goes back to hunter-gatherer days, that if somebody has more than me, they probably got it through illicit means, because there wasn't much stuff to have, which is why hunter-gatherer groups tend to be fairly egalitarian. Now, they don't necessarily want to be egalitarian, but they have lots of norms and rules that they enforce to make sure there's proper food sharing and so forth, because supplies are so limited and the resources are so difficult to get. For the group to survive, we need some kind of norms of equity and sharing and so on. And that's the world we lived in, and probably all the way up until maybe a century ago or so. There was a lot of rigged, unfair systems in the economy and in politics. So, but we don't live in that world anymore. I mean, we really have a chance now for equity and for a just and fair society, and it doesn't have to be zero sum, which is, I think, the first point to make that you just said. Just to say it again, it's not like for women to exceed in life, men have to step back or lose something.
No, absolutely. I think it's about how do we've reached a kind of a sort of inflection point where there's been male abuses of power that have been brushed under the carpet, and they've now been brought to light, and hopefully due process will kick in, and some of those people will be brought to justice. And that's an important moment, and that's a reckoning. And I think it's good for guys to take stock. But it doesn't mean that this is the time to kick men for the sake of it. This is a time to treat women better and men better. We're trying to move forward and advance as a society. It doesn't feel like that at the moment. And part of that is not living in these kind of ridiculous stereotypes. So it's not saying, well, there are men at the top and they're dominant, so therefore all men are fine. That's complete nonsense. All men aren't fine. Most men are having a really hard time at the moment, living paycheck to paycheck. And that has huge stress and impacts on families and on kids and how they're being brought up. So I think we just got to move beyond there's some really lazy stereotypes out there around women and men. I think we need to move beyond those lazy stereotypes and look at kind of the messy, nuanced realities of what it is to be a man or a woman these days.
Yeah, one of the themes of people analyzing the 2016 election, how did Trump win? How did this happen? It's unbelievable. No one anticipated this would happen. So one of the threads is that, the sort of middle-class white males in middle America, they did not profit from, the stock market rise after the meltdown and Obama took office. And the stock market's gone up, I don't know, like 300% or something since 2009. It's been great. If you have money and you have disposable income and you can invest, and if you're a guy living in New York City as a Wall Street trader or something like that, yeah. But if you're a coal miner, there was a big story on the news last night, the coal miners are actually a little pissed now because Trump said, I'm going to bring back coal, beautiful, clean coal in Virginia and Ohio and so on. It didn't happen. So these guys were saying, we might go Democrat. We just want our jobs back. So I think there's a lot of these guys, and you talk about in the book the opioid crisis as well. This is hitting mostly these sort of middle America men that are jobless, in some cases homeless and so forth. That's a problem.
And the X million jobs that were shipped to China after China was allowed to join the WTO. It might be good overall for the economy. It's good for cheap, getting your Apple cheaper or your goods cheaper. But millions of jobs have been lost there directly, and then million more indirectly. So I think in all this, we just haven't taken into account that, politics can prey on the vulnerability and the insecurity that men are feeling, who've lost their jobs, who are living paycheck to paycheck. It makes them this kind of very fertile, ripe base for someone to come along and say, I can fix this. Here are your enemies. Your enemies are women. Your enemies are trade deals. Your enemies are immigrants. I can fix this. Almost in this kind of patrician, father-like figure. I've made money. Trust me. Here are your enemies. Leave it to me. I can fix this. I'll bring your jobs back. And if you have lost your job and everything that goes with that, the kind of the self-esteem, the day-to-day, probably the good night's sleep, maybe your relationship, your mental health, possibly you've picked up an addiction, all the terrible things that have flooded your life when you as a man lose your job. If someone's going to come along and say, I can fix this, why not? Why not gamble? You might not like his political views or some of his views, but the biggest thing for you is your hunter-gathering. You have to be able to provide. You need something to do it during the day. And the rest of it might well be secondary. So unless you can fix the economy, unless you can deal with the plight that a lot of guys are in, they're going to try a radical option. They're going to vote for Brexit over here. They're going to vote for Bolsonaro in Brazil, looking at what's going on in Italy, in Greece. Men who are on the economic downers pose a real risk for society. And that's something that whether you might not have that much empathy for these guys, you might not think, well, it's not your time. But if you don't want a populist radical leader, you really got to address this.
Yeah, Trump gave a speech, I think it was in Detroit during the campaign, maybe the month or two before it, where he addressed a large group of African Americans. and basically said, look, you just had 8 years of Democrats with a African-American president and your lives suck. What have you got to lose?
Yeah.
Give me a try. And well, a lot of them did, as did 81% of white evangelicals voted for the least evangelical Christian person probably in the history of the Republic.
But I guess, the evangelicals got what they want. They got their Supreme Court picks.
Yeah, right.
As the coal miner got what he wants. Arguably not. He might like some of the crackdown on immigration, but it's not going to bring back his job.
No. So in terms of gender equality, here are some of the gaps that women probably do not want to close with men. Now, these are your 9 and a bit reasons to write this book. 1, men are 3.5 times more likely than women to take their own lives. Tragically, other than accidents, suicide is the biggest killer of males between 10 and 34 years of age. 2, the prison population is 93% male, with men receiving longer sentences than women for similar crimes, 63% more average jail time for men for federal offenses. 3, boys lag a year behind girls at reading in every industrialized country and 6 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADD. 4, men receive custody of children in only about 10% of divorce cases in the United States. Is that still true? That's really incredible. 5, men develop heart disease 10 years earlier than women. 6, 60% of the homeless are men. 7, men are more often victims of violence than women, and 1 in 3 men has experienced contact, sexual violence, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner during their lifetime. 8, 24 of the 25 lowest ranked professions in the U.S. are heavily male dominated. 9, up to 80% of couples at some fertility clinics are now requesting girls. And then 9.5 or a bit. Anesh from the Indian village of whatever that is was jailed for a year for having an affair with a shepherd's wife. Under Indian law, a man can be jailed for adultery, whereas a woman can't. Although I guess that used to be differently in biblical days. I think the death penalty in the Old Testament for adultery was for women only, not the men. Oh, and if a man had sex with an animal, the animal had to be killed for some weird reason.
Yeah.
Anyway, so those are all realities of just in terms of how dangerous it is to be. As Steve Pinker likes to say, the number one predictor of violence is maleness.
Yes. I mean, we've just seen that with the mass shootings, which seem to occur with such regularity, on your side of the pond. And it's nearly always men, and it's nearly always white guys.
Yeah.
Mass shootings seem to be guys who have that sense of entitlement, who are now racked with loss, who aren't fitting in, who don't have the jobs, who don't have that identity, who aren't part of something, and they want to go out with a bang. It's a sort of particularly white male thing that, screw you, I'm taking other people down with me. I'm gonna create this spectacle when I go out. And the difference, unfortunately, is that you've got there's access to guns where you are.
Yeah.
But unless you want to get a handle on these mass shootings, as Steve Pinker says, you've got to get a handle on maleness, unfortunately, and that's been driven home with regularity, I guess, in the States.
Yeah, absolutely. There was another potential mass public shooting that was thwarted because the guy had posted something on Facebook that he wanted to break the record. Going for the world record for the most people killed in a single mass public shooting. They keep score. It's like they're like young men who wanted to be athletes, but there's no sport available, or they didn't get raised with sports or whatever. They're going back to their caveman instincts. I've got to compete against these other men.
No, it's that male sense of competition, but in the most gruesome, way that you can imagine, and probably radicalized in chat rooms and so on. So, it does feel that when you put all those figures together, it's sort of like there's a crisis. If this was applied to any other group, this would be major news. This is a crisis, but because we're dealing with millennia of male dominance and men at the top still doing really well and being very prominent, it just doesn't register. When you talk about the male crisis, you're often met by people rolling their eyes and like, oh, what have men got to complain about? And it's like, yeah, some guys really have nothing to complain about. They have fabulous lives, but like, read these 9 statistics and then tell me something hasn't gone terribly pear-shaped.
Yeah. Yeah. How's the reception been of your, I think it was published a few months before it came out here. How's the reception been in England for this? I saw a few interviews you did where you got some pushback. A little bit.
I mean, there's lazy journalism, which I'm familiar with, and I'm sure you are, and I don't mind that. You get it, and then you say, okay, look at the male suicide rate, look at the homeless rate, look at the incarceration rate. Tell me this isn't a story.
Yeah.
It feels like there's. I mean, I did a radio show a few years ago called Men's Hour on the BBC, and when that first launched, there were howls of farce. It's like, come on, what are you doing? This is ridiculous. Ha ha ha. It feels like a few years later, particularly around the kind of mental health crisis and probably the opioid crisis, there's more of a willingness to take it seriously. There's more of a willingness to say, actually, things might be going wrong with men. And in the meantime, you've had people like Prince Harry and Prince William over here talk about mental health, and sportsmen have been coming out, and veterans. So it feels like the kind of male mental health crisis has at least got a look in.
Yeah.
But overall, I still think there's some skepticism, because it's, as you said at the top, it's not seen as our time. But I don't think it's our time or your time. It's just time. It's just time to deal with men and women. And I don't delineate between human beings who are having a hard time.
Yeah. My class started this week at Chapman University. I have 25 students at the seminar every semester. And so as usual, for the last, 5 years or so, I have 17 women and 8 guys. And it's been like that for years. At Chapman, I think it's roughly 60-40 about what the national average is. Why are men not going to college as much as they used to, at least in that ratio?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the figures is that I think certainly in the UK, girls are a third more likely to go to university now.
Yeah.
The education system isn't serving boys well, and that goes back right to primary school. Boys are they need to run around more. They're washed in androgen sex hormones before they've even born. They have this greater need to run around and be boisterous and learn actively. But the modern education system is geared around, well, sit at your desk, sit nicely, learn passively, and if you're boisterous, you're a bad boy, and we're going to mark you down. That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's no way to learn, and it's no wonder that boys are more likely to have ADD. I mean, I know there are other factors in there. It's not just having to sit around too much. So it's no wonder boys play up. From the very beginning, the education system doesn't suit boys. And they're less likely to succeed at school. And that also means that they're less likely to be geared up for the types of jobs that we're going to get. You're not going to get a manual labor job in the future. As automation kicks in, even a sort of semi-skilled job like driving is going to largely disappear. So, we've seen the impact of, I think, 3 or 4 million manufacturing jobs moving to China. Just wait until the driving jobs disappear in the States. It's like, you want a bunch of angry men. This is going to grow exponentially unless men have the skills to deal with the jobs that are going to exist in the future, and that isn't going to work unless we radically overhaul the education system so it suits boys and girls.
Yeah, I have a 3-year-old boy, and I have a 27-year-old daughter from a previous marriage, and the differences are pretty dramatic from the get-go, like from day one. And my little guy, he is so physically active. I mean, it's exhausting, when I have him for a couple hours. And this gets to, with the value of childcare and so on. My poor wife, my God, I'm exhausted when she finally comes home and takes over. I'm like, oh man, I am beat. This little guy's up and down, upstairs, downstairs, front yard, backyard, boom, boom, boom.
Yeah.
And, if you try to sit him down in a classroom with, rows of desks, forget it. Now, maybe that'll change in 2 years when he's supposed to go. But we're looking at this Montessori school in Santa Barbara where we live, where, it's very unstructured. You move around, they have a lot of physical tasks. You're learning concepts by manipulating objects, in different, little platforms that they have set up in the classroom or outside and so on. That to me seems more natural for what you're talking about. Much of, I'm sure there are real ADD issues, but the idea that you're ADD because you can't sit for an hour or two straight in a desk in a row staring at a teacher, that's insane.
Yeah, and then we over medicalize it. I mean, the Victorians kind of had this view of muscular Christianity, that you were close to God if you were running around on a football pitch or a rugby pitch,
right,
or a cricket pitch, covered in mud, and then having a freezing cold shower, and that would make you the kind of man to go off and run the empire, which is probably largely what the Conservative Party here think at the moment. But there was something to the kind of physicality of education. When I was at school, we barely did any sport.
Right.
So I think they are. When you meet a 3-year-old, I've not met yours, Michael, but they're sort of like feral beasts. They're kind of like little drunks that, you just got to run them like dogs. Got to run them, get the energy out, and teach them in kind of creative ways. And but the education system isn't kind of there for men, boys, and you see it time after time, and I have no idea why it doesn't change.
Yeah, well, probably just lack of recognition or research on that is a problem to be solved. Yeah. My friend Jeffrey Miller, the evolutionary psychologist, he recently did an interview with an Antifa member who's he's in Albuquerque. He's Antifa members in Albuquerque, although they're all over the world. So this is a young man. He's 24 or 25 or something like this, and maybe a little older. But basically, he was describing what it's like to be Antifa, like he was a footballer. Like he was, a sports athlete achieving the highest rank. And he was talking about the internal dynamics of being a part of Antifa. We get dressed up in these black uniforms with the helmet, and we're out there with our sticks and we're mixing it up. And of course, they have an ideology behind it. We, social justice, we're going to defeat the fascists and the Nazis and all this stuff. I mean, they feel emboldened, like we are defeating evil, so this is good. But there was definitely a kind of a young male element to it. Like we love getting out there and mixing it up, physically mixing it up with these bad people. And again, it reminded me of being, watching European soccer matches or whatever, where, afterwards they pile into the tube and they mix it up on the, in the bus or whatever, the train. And it's like, whoa.
Yeah, and we used to have that in when we were working in the coal mines. We had that kind of physicality around people, going to the pub afterwards. I was looking at a case of, there were kind of a handful of British guys who went out to join Islamic State, ISIS, and for some of them you can't quite work out why they've done it, and they were sort of doing these sort of jobs like working in stores, probably a bit like Walmart or something. You can sort of, and then they kind of went out there, they described themselves as like some sort of bad boys brigade. They gave themselves like a name like that, and they kind of swapped working in as a store called Primark, or it's like a Walmart, to go out there and to be part of something and kind of run around with guns and uniforms. And there's some element, I think, with the kind of foreign fighters, especially, went out to ISIS, which was people who were these lost young men who had this kind of fucked up vision of the world, and thought they could express themselves and their masculinity by being part of something and fighting for something. There is that innate sort of male thing through history to fight, to be part of something. And thankfully, ours is largely a generation where we haven't had drafts. We haven't been called upon to fight.
Right.
So how do you prove yourself? It's what can you fight for?
Right.
And you can see the attraction of something like Antifa or the more extreme things if you've been radicalized. If you're vulnerable and you're feeling, not like we're tribal. We want to be part of something. We used to be part of religions. We used to be part of trade unions. We used to be part of workforces. We used to stand in the terraces in our soccer stadiums and be part of something. And that kind of modern economy and the kind of gentrification means we're not really part of anything. We're not religious as much. We're certainly not over here, but you are more in the States. our football grounds are fairly sanitized now and gentrified. We're not in trade unions. So how do you get that sort of tribal
Yeah.
sense of being?
Yeah, the comedian Bill Maher here has he has a funny little riff on the ISIS guys in their training camps. He always shows this video of the guys on the monkey bars. You know, they're doing the little,
Yeah.
and it's like it kind of makes fun of them because they look like idiots, like this. But really, they just look like athletes at a training camp getting ready for the big game.
Mm.
You know, and it's like, well, yeah, I mean, that's, you sort of see the appeal of a young man who has nothing, and you get to be part of this great cause, assuming you believe their ideology, and you get women and free sex, and it's like, well, okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's for the sort of sexually frustrated young man. It's the perfect outlet if you don't mind a horrific neo-Nazi ideology. You know,
right.
what's to lose? Yeah.
Totally fascistic.
Yeah.
When I was reading your book, I remembered a couple of passages from Steve Pinker's "The Better Angels of Our Nature." On first of all, there was the the ethical warrior code. This is in the section of the decrease of violence in war and how attitudes about war and conflict have changed. This change is palpable within the American military itself. Military leaders at all levels have become aware that gratuitous killing is a public relations disaster at home and counterproductive abroad, alienating allies and emboldening enemies. The Marine Corps has instituted a martial arts program in which leathernecks are indoctrinated in a new code of honor, the ethical Marine warrior. The catechism is, the ethical warrior is a protector of life. Whose life? Self and others. Which others? All others. Anyway, so he talks about that a little bit, and he says the code of the ethical warrior, even as an aspiration, shows that the American armed forces have come a long way from the time when its soldiers referred to Vietnamese peasants as gooks, slopes, and slants, and when the military was slow to investigate atrocities against civilians, such as the massacre at My Lai. As former Marine Captain Jack Hoban, who helped to implement the ethical warrior program, wrote to me, quote, "When I first joined the Marines in the 1970s, it was kill, kill, kill. The probability that there would have been an honor code that trained Marines to be protectors of all others, including the enemy if possible, would have been 0%. So, you know, that comes a long way from what we've been. Then Steve also has some excerpts of how people just a century ago, sort of late 19th, early 20th century, described war. You know, Alexis de Tocqueville said this would have been before that. War is almost always enlarges the mind of a people and raises their character. Emile Zola, war is life itself. We must eat and be eaten so that the world might live. It is only warlike nations which have prospered. A nation dies as soon as it disarms. John Ruskin, when I tell you that war is the foundation of all the arts, I mean also that it is the foundation of all the high virtues and faculties of man. Friedrich Hegel, wars are terrible but necessary, for they save the state from social petrifaction and stagnation. Thomas Mann, war is purging and a liberation. Of course, they're sitting home writing about war instead of being on the front lines doing it. But, you know, that's kind of capturing that historically very common attitude. Like, war is great. Men got to get out there. They have this urge to mix it up and be part of something. And so the consequences be damned. And it's only recently that we've come to think, well, maybe that's not so good.
Yeah. I mean, I think attitudes probably shifted after the First World War. Though, you know, in that war, Winston Churchill himself wrote of the sort of the pleasure he actually found. You know, it seemed to help his depression, really, being
right
on the battlefield. Having spent time with veterans suffering from PTSD, that feels like quite the antidote to that sort of war talk. I mean, I think part of that was the kind of industrialized killing machines that were the First World War and the Second World War probably hadn't quite taken root in the popular psyche, and you know, there was, in that kind of imperial age, it was sort of almost part of the it was part of the national mood, really, to keep people sort of prepped for war, so we could go out conquer different countries, and eventually we lost you guys, but there we go. But I've got to say, having spent time with guys who are still suffering every day from going back to the Falklands War in the early 80s, certainly the first Gulf War, and the recent Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, and also Bosnia, being with guys who, if they're sat in a cafe and someone opens a curtain on the other side of the road, will hit the deck, or can't go out in public, or have been self-medicating for decades, and getting these awful flashbacks. It's a very sobering experience. If you ever get kind of caught up in this kind of machismo, jingoism, and isn't war a good thing? I spent time with a charity called Combat Stress over here. I spent time in a Chicago VA hospital with some Vietnam vets who were using art therapy to try and kind of heal those wounds. And if you look at the suicide rate in the US of guys who've come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, it's just, it's off the charts. More people have killed themselves than have been killed on the battlefield. It's a testament to how badly we treat returned servicemen and women, but also the psychological scars that come, especially from a war where it doesn't feel black and white. It was one thing to fight in the Second World War, come back, be treated a hero, and have fought evil. That was pure evil. But to fought in Vietnam, to have fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, to come back to what? We're in peace talks at the moment with the Taliban. What was all that about?
Yeah. Trump just talked about that the other day. It's like, we're talking to the Taliban. It's like, what? But think 17 and a half years now.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Probably do have to speak at this stage, but thousands of lives were lost and countless more shattered. For what? And I think that feeds the PTSD. If you can't justify what you've done, if you don't feel proud of what you've done, I think that genuinely makes things worse. If you don't have that validation for what you've done was a great and noble thing. It was really one thing to stop Hitler in his tracks. It's another to have won Helmand province, which has now been handed back to the Taliban, and it's like, what the fuck was that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now last year or 2 years ago, I guess I binge watched Ken Burns' documentary series on the Vietnam War. And, afterwards, I just wanted to put my head in the oven and turn on the gas. It was just so depressing, just unbelievably depressing, and just stupid. And we knew at the time, this is not going to go well. It's just not. And, there's all the, Kennedy's, what's his name? McNamara, with his charts and graphs, we're almost there. We're turning the corner. We're just about to, it was never ending. So, obviously we're coming to the grips that, war is a bad idea for all these reasons and more. And yet men have this impulse to do something. So at least there's been the rise of sports. I was lucky as a young man to be involved in sports most of my life, and I could sort of channel that. I'm not saying I'd be out, pillaging villages if I wasn't playing sports, but I get the impulse. I understand why, a lot of these young men want to join these groups. I hammered on Antifa a little bit. I should point out the Proud Boys, on the other side,
sure.
They're just as bad, and they have the same, kind of ideological background. We're fighting these evil liberals, or these, the immigrants are coming, and or the non-white people that want to take our culture and so on. It's just as crazy an ideology. But the psychology behind it is the same. We get to dress, we're the Proud Boys, and, we get to dress up and go out there and mix it up with these other bad people. It's same thing.
I spent some time with a Proud Boy in North Carolina. And,
you did?
He'd been, he was an Army veteran as well, come back a bit lost, looking for something to latch onto, looking to be part of something. It is that We have that tribal urge to be part of something. There's even that kind of quasi-uniform. We want the belonging, and we want to fight. I guess it's how can you direct that to fight for good causes? Fight for more social equality. Fight for something. Fight for something good. I in my own limited experience, I've done work around death row, and like a guy who has ended up there who I know is innocent. And I put myself on the line a bit for that and try to track down the people who were ultimately responsible for the murder. And you feel, when you're fighting for something that you believe in, you feel good about it. You think, I'm doing more than just look after my own interests, and that feels good. So I guess it's how can you take that impulse and channel it, not with a bunch of douchebags either on the far right or the far left.
Right. Yeah. So, well, it's one of the counterintuitive notions of Martin Luther King's, nonviolent resistance, which is so hard to do. How these guys stood there with these dogs and the hoses and the brutal police and not fight back, because that is that's a natural human inclination to want to fight back. And that's super hard to do. And it's, I'm always posting stuff about, there's data now showing if you want social change, nonviolent means are a more effective way to do it than violent means, and so on. But, it's still the human urge to punch a Nazi, as they say. There's that video of Richard Spencer, that he's a white supremacist, and bam, cold cock from the side. I have to, we all condemn that, but I have to say, I'd like to punch that motherfucker. He's an asshole, and it's like, that's kind of the natural impulse we have.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's, how do you channel that now? I mean, the rainforests are burning.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Channel it into something, something tangible and meaningful, and, fight for something. I guess you've got the elections coming up. Channel it into that, and if you really would need to punch someone, go and do martial art.
Right.
Which, like, genuinely, in my own experience, is you can feel amazing after that.
That's right. You did some martial arts, right?
Yeah, I ended up bizarrely on a Krav Maga course.
What is that?
It's an Israeli martial art, which was actually pioneered in the 1930s in Eastern Europe to effectively fight fascists on the streets. And then an immigrant took it over to Israel, and it's become the kind of de facto martial art for the security forces there. And it's based on maximum efficiency and minimal looking fancy. And it's kind of like, how do you disable someone as quickly as you can? And I had 10 days of doing that, and I felt, in terms of feeling like a man, I mean, that was peak masculinity. You're kind of running down the beach, learning a martial art, you're fighting and you're punching, and you feel great and you get out of your system. So, likewise over here, I've seen guys who've got anxiety disorders who've taken up a form of boxing therapy, and it's turned them around. Just that there's something about
physicality. Yeah.
Physicality and we don't get, we have such sedentary lives. We sit on our asses all day. We just don't use our bodies enough. We don't expend the energy. And as well as becoming obese and diabetic, we're not getting stuff out of our system. We're walking around in the bodies that our caveman ancestors did 10,000 years. It's a blink of an eye in evolution.
Yeah.
And these funny enough, I do a wellness podcast for the BBC called All Hail Kale, a sort of discerning look at wellness, and we're doing something on exercise at the moment. And I spoke to a hunter-gatherer the other day. I managed to get a member of the Hazda tribe on the phone in Tanzania, and I was trying to ask him, does he ever go out for a run? Does he go for a jog for pleasure? And he could not understand what I was talking about. It's the equivalent of me saying to a factory worker, hey, do you ever, the weekend, you just go and put a few more hours in the factory for fun?
Right.
Because for him it was, well, I spend I don't know, maybe 2 hours walking to that place to then spend hours tracking an animal to hunt it to then come back, and that's how we're designed. We are designed to be out walking, and then bursts of energy to maybe try and catch an animal, or and then come back. We're not sat around on our arse as much, and so he's living the life that we're sort of designed to.
Right.
He's got the rush of adrenaline from hunting. He's living in the kind of extended family. His testosterone is getting a good workout during the day. You get in your car, you drive to work, you sit at your desk in an open plan office. It's the kind of antithesis of how we're designed. And one of the things men and women have to sort of look at is the lives we live are so out of kilter with how our bodies are designed, as well as kind of screwing our health. And if you look at obesity and diabetes and all that sort of thing, we're also kind of not releasing the hormones that we need to be doing that as well. So how else can we do that? And I think martial arts or sport is such a good way to approximate how our cavemen and women bodies are designed and what they want us to do.
So your correspondent is not going to Gold's Gym in the evening and hitting the weights?
Am I doing that?
No, your correspondent, your hunter-gatherer correspondent.
No. I was speaking to a Harvard anthropologist, Dan Lieberman, who's written a great book on kind of how the body's designed. He's doing something on exercise, and he spent time out in the field. And I said, have you ever come across, when you've ever been out there, like maybe they just pick up rocks and start bench pressing? And he was just like, no. He said, no, I've never. And also, if I go for a jog, they look at me like I'm absolutely insane.
That's funny. Right.
There goes the white academic running without reason.
Right. Yeah. Do you have an opinion on diet, nutrition, and what's healthy? I mean, I think it's clear exercise is super critical, but I ask everybody on this podcast that I come across that knows something about this. The plant-based diet is always, has been the latest thing, but now more recently, meat is okay, butter is okay, eggs are okay, animal products are okay, and I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
It's funny because I'm doing an All Hail Kale episode on whether people should bring up their babies vegan, and then another one on the kind of fat versus sugar battle. So I'm kind of steeped in this research at the moment. It feels like the sugar lobby screwed dietary guidelines, and suppressed the research which was saying that there's good fat and bad fat. So we've lumped fat together as this kind of amorphous blob of badness, when in fact, we really need good fat, whether it's avocados, nuts, that sort of thing. And protein seems to be really important for mental health and getting the neurotransmitters to fire properly. The challenge with a kind of plant-based diet, and I don't eat much animal stuff, is getting the protein, and it can get quite complicated. Like you need to mix a complex carbohydrate or a grain with that protein to release it. So you need to know what you're doing if you are plant-based. But there is more research saying that unless you get enough protein and some of those B vitamins, it's going to affect your neurotransmitters, which affects your mood. So.
It's clear sugar is bad. I mean, I've been friends with Gary Taubes since the 90s when he was first on this stuff, and he was considered completely out of his mind and total heretic and crazy. And turns out that was right. Sugar is not good. But finding the right balance seems to be the tricky part here. How much meat? I mean, a steak once a week, and what kind of meat should I have? Like my friend Joe Rogan, he hunts his own meat, and he posts on Twitter, here's my boar steak or elk steak, and I shot this thing. And, he's got that with some Brussels sprouts and an avocado. It's like, that looks like a really healthy meal. What's wrong with that?
I mean, I guess if you go back to the sort of hunter-gathering, meat was possibly more of a luxury than a staple. The reason why apparently, I mean, we don't know for sure, that there was gender equality was because men and women often gathered the same amounts of calories. So they might be gathering fruits, nuts, berries, grains, would be out hunting, but might well come back empty-handed. So the idea that our ancestors were eating meat all the time and that's what they lived off isn't true.
Right.
And interesting, there's one tribe who've been studied who apparently they exhibit something called meat hunger, where when they don't get enough meat, or even when they're getting other forms of protein, they fantasize about it. They're obsessed with meat. So I think, I guess it probably comes down to sparse amounts of meat, and from a gut point of view, which is obviously all the rage, having as many different types of fruits and vegetables and nuts as possible, because we would have had a lot of seasonal vegetables. It would have been organic. It would have been much richer in microbiome diversity than we get now. So, listen, I mean, if I pan the camera around, there's a jar of kombucha being brewed at the moment.
Right.
There's some oats that are being left out to ferment.
Right.
I've really bought into the idea that we need more fermented food, because if 90% of your serotonin, the chemical that is essential to your moods, that's what Prozac is based on, SSRIs. 90% of your serotonin is based in your gut. There's a direct nerve, the vagus nerve, that goes from your gut to your brain. Having done an episode on that last season, I've become, quite into the idea I've got to look after my gut, because the way we live now, again, isn't, we used to be surrounded by animals. We used to get our hands dirty in the soil. The soil wasn't degraded. We used to have a lot more seasonal fruit and vegetables. This is what we need, which is why hunter-gatherers have a much higher gut diversity than we do.
This is the microbiome?
Yeah, the microbiome, sometimes called your second brain. It's the kind of trillions of microorganisms that live in us that also have their own DNA. And so if you add all that together, they've got more DNA. We're sort of carrying around more of their DNA than ours. So how do you keep them happy? And that's through avoiding, sugar's no good, processed foods are no good, things like enzymes, artificial sweeteners, no good. Trying to avoid, again, one of the arguments around meat is that if the meat's been reared using antibiotics, then that might get into our system. So kind of avoiding that crap whilst trying to feed as much naturally fermented foods and pre and probiotics, so kind of leafy greens, and then kefir, kombucha, sauerkraut, all that kind of pure sort of raw stuff. Sort of feed the stomach with all this.
Are you a vegetarian, or are you more of a minimalist, or reducitarian?
Probably. I was a teenage vegetarian activist because I liked the Smiths and they were vegetarian, and a pop band over here.
All right.
Now I've been told to eat more fish. I don't really. Fish. So I'm told to eat more fish. There's a farmer's market here. You can get organic salmon, so it hasn't got the growth hormones in.
Right.
I have more eggs than I used to.
You do.
There's a cardiologist here called Dr. Asim Malhotra, who's kind of led the fight against big sugar, who said, he's a cardiologist and he starts all his day with eggs and butter. And it's kind of the kind of inverse of what we would have thought maybe a decade ago. Protein, I think if you don't eat much meat, you've got to really look at your sources of protein.
So eggs would be pretty good.
Eggs are good. Eggs are really very good for that. Obviously, meat's high in protein if you want to have that, and then you have to combine it if you're having things like soya and tofu and stuff. But I guess in the last few years, you don't want to become a bore about this. You don't want to. You don't want to become the person that won't go somewhere for dinner or go up. It's all about keeping things.
I'm friends with John Mackey, the CEO of Whole Foods.
Yeah,
and he lives the ideology. He's a vegan. He's serious about it, and I've every year at Freedom Fest, we have a dinner that together at a restaurant with a few other friends. And yeah, we eat at like these restaurants are so fine, they don't even have prices on the menu. If you have to ask, you shouldn't be eating there. Okay. So of course I order the biggest steak or, steak and lot, whatever because I'm going to enjoy this, and John orders a salad. He brings his own dressing and it's really funny. He's like, okay, he's living it. But, I just can't, for me, I can't go that far about it. He makes good arguments for why the vegan diet is the healthiest. I've heard him debate. He makes good arguments. But then I had like Nina Teicholz on the podcast, and she wrote that book, Big Fat Surprise, about the research and how problematic it was back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And, asking people, what did you eat this week, as if that's a reliable measuring technique. I didn't go once to McDonald's. Well, maybe 3 times. Well, maybe every day. Well, anyway, people are not too honest about that. And so on. So I'm very conflicted. I hear arguments on both sides. What you just said seems pretty reasonable to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably predominantly plant-based, as many different fruits and vegetables as possible, putting some whole grains in there and making sure you get your protein from different sources and having like tons of fermented food. I think.
What about alcohol? What about like beer and wine?
I mean, look, I'm British. I'm never going to say cut that out.
Good.
I mean, again, there's some suggestion that the occasional glass of red wine is also good for your gut.
Yeah.
Probably beer less so. Like the research changes so often that a bit of something, a bit of what you like isn't going to kill you. But I think as long as the kind of broad guidelines, are there. But at the moment, I'm recording with a couple who are debating whether or not to bring up their baby, which is due next month, vegan. So we're kind of assembling experts. And
so no milk? Or they have like almond milk or something?
Well, I mean, there's going to be breast milk, but if, no milk, no eggs. Plus, she won't eat anything like that if she does agree this while she's breastfeeding. And from the experts I've spoken to so far, I don't know if it's definitive yet, the sense is, in theory, you can do this, but in practice, you probably won't be able to pull it off. And also, you'll probably have to supplement. And is it a good idea to start giving babies too many supplements? So, I mean, I think there's one expert who's been saying, according to my researcher, there might be some. They might not grow as tall as they would have done otherwise, but that's a good thing because tall people die earlier. So
that's too funny. Okay, oh my God. Well, okay.
There's the upside of stunted growth.
Right.
But it's with all this, as I'm sure you're aware, you have to look at who's saying what and why.
Yeah.
Who's being paid.
Yeah.
Who has an agenda. Who has become messianic in their beliefs, where they're picking and choosing the data, and there's a lot of people out there with agendas. Food becomes a real passion issue as well. So
reading Gary Taubes and Nina Teicholz, it was. I mean, some of these food companies are almost as bad as the tobacco industry.
Without a doubt, the efforts of Big Sugar to suppress the data that was coming out in the 70s is probably on a par with Big Tobacco. And if you look at the lives lost through diabetes,
terrible.
Worse
than tobacco, probably.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So I don't know. Go and have some sauerkraut. You'll be all right.
Well, one of the things I love about your writing, and particularly Future Man book, is you're kind of in person. I went there and met this person, and then you present the research. So let's talk about in your chapter on porn. We did a whole issue of Skeptic on porn, for and against. I had on the against side Phil Zimbardo. Let's see what's his article was called "How Porn is Messing with Your Manhood." His book is Man Interrupted. So they present data, studies, and so forth, showing that excessive porn watching, particularly amongst teens and men in their early 20s, it distorts what they think is normal sex. So when they do have sex with a woman, they're expecting she's going to act like this because this is what I've been watching every 2 hours on porn, whatever. And of course, they normal women don't act like that. Or if they masturbate too much, then their sex urge goes down. He cites studies showing erectile dysfunction which used to be like 1 to 2%, is now like 20% amongst, men 15 to 25 or 30 or so. But then I got a counter article from Marty Klein, who wrote a book called His Porn, Her Porn, Healing America's Pornography Obsession and Honest Talk About Sex. So he said, it's like the diet thing. He goes, okay, these studies are flawed for this reason and this reason and this reason. And I read all that. And I'm like, okay, I really don't know what to think. And so we opened his article with a tweet from Sarah Silverman, who says, I totally understand people who think porn is evil. I feel the exact same way 1 to 2 seconds after I orgasm from porn. So you have a whole chapter on that. You actually came out to the Valley here. I'm in Santa Barbara, but just, down in the Los Angeles Valley, the Valley is where like 70% of porn is produced. I have no idea historically how that came about, but anyway, there it is. And you came out and met some people. So talk a little bit about what you found on that issue.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like when I went out, I had a fairly liberal view of porn. I guess I grew up in an era where it was magazines that you might buy when you're a teenager and hide in another magazine and smuggle out the shop, or at university, there'd be a dare and someone would have to go off to the petrol station and come back with a magazine. So it was all seemed fairly harmless. But having spent time on porn sets, I left thinking this is a really grubby, damaging, horrible industry. The idea that it's empowering for women, I just didn't see that at all. The women performers I met were virtually all damaged or exploited, or both. There was a lot of addiction. There was a lot of exploitive managers or boyfriends who pushed them into it. There was a male porn star who I spoke to who said, that what he, his saying was, "Mummy didn't love them enough, Daddy loved them too much." The males seemed less affected. I think as a man, you can probably divorce what you're doing emotionally from physically more, probably. So I thought it was harming the performers, especially the women, and it was exploitative, and they were, the churn was huge. People don't stay in that business for long. The impact.
Hang on for a second. So, the counter argument is, well, these women are adults. They choose to do this. They're paid for it. So what's wrong with that?
Yeah, I mean, on a kind of purely libertarian basis, they've made that choice under free will to some extent. Some of them might not have done. They've been pushed and coerced into it by abusive partners. There was a performer I met who I just couldn't work out why. She was really smart and sassy and seemed to have a really nice childhood. I couldn't work out why she was in it. And even she said that her boyfriend, who was her manager, had her passport. She was from a different country. Whoa. And it's like, wow, even she's not got her passport. That's quite something.
Right. So she's not free. You're not really free.
No, or
it is what I think too, because I used to be pretty libertarian about all these things. Prostitution, for example, it's none of my business what consulting adults do, and if they want to exchange money for sex, what do I care? But when you really look into it, it's like most of these women are not really free. They're not really making free choices like you and I freely choose to go work out or take this job or whatever. It's not the same. The level of exploitation, control, drugs, addiction, starting at an early age when you're not really, maybe at 15 or 13 or 16, you don't really have the developed prefrontal cortex to make rational decisions about your life. Those sorts of things come into play, it seems to me.
Yes, or out of economic necessity, you've ended up there, or there's been a slippery slope from stripping to this to that. So I thought it was very damaging to the performers, and I think it's probably pretty damaging to the consumers. This isn't a magazine in a few moments. This is getting into your brain wiring. online porn. This is people. This is addiction. This is craving harder and harder stuff to get that hit. This is people ending up with taste they wouldn't have had before, which might be exploding their relationships. And then, that sort of stuff we kind of know, and we get, one of the authors you were quoting, talks about the problems that young boys especially are having, where, well, and girls as well, who, they see this stuff, they think this is the norm. And it largely isn't necessarily. And then I was filming with this company in LA, and the guy just said to me, I said, do you get a lot of fan mail? And he said, yeah, we do. And I said, anywhere in particular? And he said, yeah, we actually get quite a lot from Ghana. I was like, really? It's like, yeah, we do. We get a couple of letters a week from Ghana. I was like, how come? Because I don't know. And I said, can I see one? He went away and he came out of the letter, and there's a guy who sent in a photograph of himself topless, a kind of very innocent looking guy, who'd written in saying, I'd like to be a performer. And I was like, wow. And I said to my crew, I said, let's go and find this guy.
You did?
So on a whim, we got on a flight and we went to Accra. And I spoke to the public health experts there, who said it was becoming a real problem for them. It was actually starting to undermine their progress they'd been making against HIV/AIDS.
Mm.
And I met a couple of guys who said they'd had no sex education whatsoever, and then they'd seen hardcore, Western porn, which is majority condom free. I think there's one company in LA that routinely uses condoms. So they said, well, White's right, and we copied that, and we did that, and they'd contracted HIV by copying what they'd seen from the porn which came from LA. I then went up to a village in the more rural north, and it was extraordinary. It was a village without electricity, where it was sort of mud and straw huts. It was, everything you think of when I say African village to you. But once a week, they would bring a generator into the village and turn one of the mud huts into a porn cinema and show the porn from LA. Somehow this porn from LA had got over there, the DVDs. And the problem in that village was that the people there didn't believe in masturbation. Mm. So you had all these guys who watched it, who were horny, who would then go out and assault the women in the village to do what they had to. And some of the young teenagers were saying, yeah, no, the older guys go and tell us to bring women over. And there were people there who were describing their marriages of 30 years had gone to shit because the guys had been watching this porn and wanting, and so it's like, it was unbelievable that marriages were breaking up, women were being assaulted in a village in the north of Ghana without electricity because somehow Western porn had made its way in there. And in the end, I eventually tracked down this guy who'd written to the porn company. He was kind of like, his address was care of the local church. He was a virgin. He was a virgin. He was nervous. He could barely look me in the eye. But he said in all confidence, I've written to them, I'm expecting a letter back. I'm expecting I'll go over and become a porn star in LA. And I was like, wow, this is globalization.
Unbelievable.
In a way you just wouldn't imagine. So I finished that shoot and I just thought porn's no good. I guess in some circumstances for libido or amongst couples, probably has some uses. But I just thought this is no good. This is no good for anyone. I can't see anyone that's winning from this. The performers, consumers, kids, developing world. This is, if you could put a genie back in the bottle, porn would definitely be amongst them. So my previously libertarian, I'm fairly socially libertarian. Do what you want to do if it doesn't harm others generally. But if I could regulate her on porn, I definitely would. I have to say, it was a real test of my principles. So yeah, not good generally.
Yeah. Yeah, that escalating need for more stimulation and variety definitely disrupts any kind of normal sequence of relationships you might have. Phil Zimbardo's article I mentioned in his book talks about, I forget, it's like the average guy goes through like 2 or 3 dozen windows open, clicking open different porn sites, different videos, and so on before they finally get off. And, if you think I'm going to go out on a date and I'm going to, click through 20 different positions we're going to try or whatever, or 20 different women, this is just totally unrealistic.
Yeah. I mean, there is ethical porn, probably largely female directed, which is out there. So,
you mean where there's an actual story and there's relationships and feelings?
yeah. Well, I think especially where the performers are judged to be not being manipulated or co-opted, and maybe they're an actual couple. So I guess there's ethical porn if you want, or maybe some retro 70s porn.
But the consumption, I forget what it's like 95% consumers are male or something like that. It's pretty high. I forget what the number is.
I don't know the figure, but it's I mean, it's there are women consumers, but I think it's still guys.
Jeffrey Miller, I mentioned Jeffrey Miller, the evolutionary psychologist, talks about these sex differences, these gender differences in preferences for sex. Women need a reason to have sex. Men need a place. There's that famous study done at an American university where the shill working for the experimenter it's a student, walks up to another student. Says, I saw you standing there. I found you attractive. Would you go out on a date with me tonight? And so they mixed the genders, male to female, female to male, whatever. And that got both for both genders about 50-50 yeses. Then the second scenario was, I saw you standing there. I found you attractive. Would you go back to my apartment with me tonight? And there it shifted to, like 70-30 or something like that. Maybe it was 80-20. And then the last one, I saw you standing there, found you attractive. I was wondering if you'd have sex with me tonight. And there it shifted to, like 95% zero. Not one woman said yes. Not one. Not even a low percent. Not even one person said yes. And, so here you see this, these kind of differences that probably does play out in porn preferences. And then the porn just accelerates that even more.
Yes. I mean, I was on slightly thin ice. I was trying to write about whether men can have emotion-free sex more easily than women. And the female friends I was bouncing around with this were like, you can't say that, certain friends would say, yeah, I can do that, no problem, or I can't, so, but what is clear is that men are wired to be more visually stimulated. The amygdala in the brain is more visually. The visuals play more of a part in our arousal, which is why, I was sort of writing that for men, one of the greatest joys is to receive a sext. Whereas I speak to female friends, and if they've been sent a photograph of a man's bits and pieces, they're like, oh, why did he send that? I was with a friend last week in the pub. She said she was chatting to a guy from one of the dating sites. It was going really well. And then he sent an unsolicited cock shot, and she was like, oh, look at it. It's ridiculous. On its own, this is ridiculous, and it's ruined it. But, so there's kind of a bit of visual wiring going on there as well.
Well, that there was a story about, Louis C.K. masturbating in front of women, these, fellow comedians and so on. That was a big story. Or other, there was somebody else, the senator who was running for office in New York City. He did a lot of dick pics.
Yeah.
And one explanation for this by the evolutionary psychologist is because if you do the interchangeable perspectives, like, how would I feel if a woman masturbated in front of me? Well, I would like that very much. Thank you. So she must like that also. And the answer is no, actually they don't. And according to, I think there was a study on YouPorn or Pornhub, one of those, but like the most popular videos that people watch, and female masturbation is like one of the most popular ones. So guys like watching that. So then they think, well, if I like watching that, then she probably likes watching me doing that. And the answer is no, actually,
Yeah, I mean,
reciprocal.
I guess the issue is when it becomes a sort of power thing as well. If it's a,
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
it's one thing to do that in a relationship of equal power, but when it's a well-known comedian who's I think a lot of the kind of Me Too stuff has really been it's around the kind of male abuse of power, as well as the kind of more egregious outright assault. Wiener, wasn't it? That was the guy.
Weiner. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Anthony Weiner. Yes.
How
Yeah.
could we get the name?
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about the Me Too movement. Clearly, this stuff still goes on. I'm amazed that the Hollywood casting couch was still there all the way up until like last year. I mean, a lot. I'm 64, so but I started getting the message, say, in the late 80s, early 90s, as a professor. Do not have relationships with the students. I mean, this used to go on all the time, and they started cracking down, and then in the 2000s, we all had to take these online courses. I think it's pretty clear, people, someone like Harvey Weinstein, well, that's that, in my generation, that was acceptable. No, actually, no, that's not the case. That really started shifting. I mean, maybe an old guy like, there was a famous interview with Sean Connery with Barbara Walters, where he made a little joke about, you slap them and shack them. And I couldn't believe he said this. And she's like, wait, what? What did you just say about women? You slap them and shack them, and it's like, holy shit. Okay, maybe he's old enough to say, well, that's how it used to be in the 40s or 50s, or like John. Yeah. There was an interview in Playboy magazine with John Wayne in 1970, where he said some pretty disparaging things about Native Americans that you would never say today, and he's been kind of dug back out of the grave to be crucified for this, as if a guy born in 1910 or whatever he was born, would be woke like we are today. But still, so, I mean, the Me Too movement clearly was a long time coming. I'm amazed that there's a lot of guys roughly my age who didn't seem to get the memo. Or maybe if you're I've never had any kind of power like that. Maybe if you have that much power and you're kind of perverted or whatever, you just do it no matter what the culture says you shouldn't.
And it seems like with these men, there are quite a lot of enablers around them.
Right. Right.
And you've seen this with Epstein. There seem to be enablers and possibly
women
Weinstein.
Enablers.
Yeah. So there, it almost feels that when you're at a certain level of wealth or power, you get divorced from the norms. You're divorced from the norms in a lot of ways, but it's like when politicians are surrounded by yes men and women, and they kind of lose a sense of, well, this is what the average person wants or thinks. And it feels like people have lived in that kind of, in that world, especially in Hollywood, when you're a star, people don't say no to you. So it feels like a kind of awful concoction of power, of enabling, of money, and probably some really quite unpleasant people as well at the heart of it. But yeah, like you, it does feel like, wow, this took its time.
Yeah.
But it's great that there is this reckoning and there's a kind of line in the sand. And at a minimum, I think it's going to make guys just at least plant a seed in the back of your brain of, am I doing the right thing here? Which is undoubtedly a good thing. And there's been some really awful abuses of power that seem to have been caught out. I guess the caveat is just to make sure that due process doesn't get thrown away at the same time, that people are as with any allegation, given a fair chance to represent themselves.
Yeah.
And it sometimes feels, not just with this stuff, but there was a case here where there was a Nobel Prize winning cancer scientist.
Oh yeah.
Tim Hunt. So Tim Hunt, I think he was in his 70s.
Yeah.
Who made a joke when he was abroad about female scientists. It was a joke. It was a bad dad joke. It's the sort of thing your dad would make, and you'd cringe and say, "Oh, you can't say that." But it wasn't malicious, And he was hung out to dry without any inquiry, based on one eyewitness who then turned out to be pretty flaky. He was stripped of his academic positions. This is a guy in his 70s who has won a Nobel Prize for his services to cancer, who no one's made allegations about Me Too type stuff that he's done. He hasn't, seemingly. He's made a bad joke. It was a joke. And his career and reputation gets trashed. And that's the sort of thing that makes me think, whoa, no one got harmed there. It was a joke. And we don't have a right not to be offended, we don't
Right.
go, but, and jokes, or, if we can't risk a joke, then that's a loss for society. It's right that we don't bully or cause offense or tell a racist joke or, it's right that we think before we speak to not, bully or cause offense. But there are times when people will risk a joke, which I think is okay, and they just get at the wrong side of the line. And if that
There was
happens,
an academic here at, I think last year or so. I don't think he lost his job, but he got in a lot of trouble at a conference. They're at a hotel. They all pile into the elevator at the end of the day. They're going up. What floor, please? And he says, lingerie, please. And the other women are like, that's not funny. Like, okay, maybe you got to be a little more careful. I don't know, but that does seem hypersensitive. Then there are the kind of the gray areas. There's a lot of these, like, where somebody actually has sex with, a couple has sex, and then there's a regret later, and then it's made public. Who was the comedian that this happened to?
it was.
I was just trying to think of his name. Essentially,
I've got his book
essentially,
around the corner.
Essentially, it was a bad date.
Yes, Daily Show chap.
Darn, I can't remember. But basically, he went out on a date.
Yes.
And, he was being a pushy guy. He wanted to have sex, and, she wasn't sure, and probably not. But she kind of went along with it. And then, okay, so this happened, that happened. And then, the next day she writes it all up, and a week later posts it on a website. And, he's basically got to disappear for a while.
Yeah.
That's not the same clearly as Epstein or Weinstein.
No.
And then there was Emily Yelf just wrote this in The Atlantic, a story about an LA Times reporter, 2 sexual encounter incidences from like 5 years ago and 4 years ago, both consensual at the time, seemingly, but then regretted later. Both were similar, but slightly different details. And, so of course the Times has to investigate this. We have credible accusations from 2 women that you did this and so on. And there's not a lot of due process there. Basically, he's considered a predator until proven otherwise. And there's that kind of reversal of, innocent until proven otherwise, in part because women were ignored for so long. So now we've gone to the other side, like, well, we believe the women's story until it proves to be fake, like the Rolling Stone article. Everyone wanted to believe her, but then it became clear it was all a hoax. Until then, you just believe the women. And, I understand the pushback from years before when women were never believed, but now it seems like it can go the other way.
I mean, these are really difficult times. There is a necessary corrective to women not coming forward who've been assaulted or not being taken seriously.
Aziz Ansari, that's it. I just looked it up.
Chap, yeah.
Yeah. And I don't think his career has been ruined. I think
I think he managed to sort of get through that one. So there is this necessary corrective, and conviction rates are still tiny, certainly over here for sexual assaults. But I guess it's how do you maintain due process without discouraging women from coming forward and whilst taking allegations seriously, but not, in the case of something like him, where it was essentially, as I understand it, consensual, but regret afterwards. That's difficult. That shouldn't be something that you trash someone's career overall. potentially criminalize them over. So, these are, I guess we're recalibrating at the moment. And we've just got to find that equilibrium where we're not victimizing men whilst trying to make sure women are heard and men behave themselves properly.
Yeah.
Um,
Now in the state of California, we now have this affirmative consent, the law, affirmative consent at every stage of sex. Mainly this is being given to college students.
Right.
Men, young men, like you have to have consent from her affirmatively stated, forcefully that and out loud. Well, I don't know how this would ever be enforced, short of you videotape your sex, which is probably the worst thing you could possibly do because this is going to end up online somewhere, revenge porn and all that. I just don't see how this could lead to anything productive, short of just telling young men now. I'm tempted to tell my students this, although I don't lecture about this, but just don't have sex. Really, just don't do it. It's pretty risky now to everybody.
Yeah, I think the positive of it is, even if it's unenforceable, you are putting the seed in a young guy's mind, especially, of, am I totally sure she's up for this? She is consenting. She's not too drunk. She's not stoned. I'm not being too aggressive. It's a kind of, at least maybe, in the kind of frat bro culture, there are probably plenty of girls who had some really awful times on campus. So it's again, it's finding the balance. It's a good thing to instill that question in a guy's mind. But have you created a policy that's unenforceable? Probably. I in North Carolina, I met a student who said she asked her friends have to ask permission before they give her a hug. Which, to me just seems absurd. It's like, this is kind of crazy, but if that's what makes her feel comfortable, that's what makes her feel comfortable. Each to their own. I guess we're recalibrating at the moment.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. Just reminding men, women don't feel the same way about sex as men do. Don't just assume you're going to get laid and push for it. Assume you're not. Assume she doesn't want to. Assume that to start off with. But now, so my conservative friends go, see, this is what we've been saying, Christian conservatives. We've been saying, abstinence and fidelity and don't have sex. It's right there in the Bible. And then I've got to go, oh, yes, okay. Yeah. Maybe there's some kind of a point there. There's waiting and that sort of thing has some value.
Yeah, I mean, and likewise, you can point to arranged marriages having lower divorce rates.
Right,
You can find the germ within religion of success on the surface, but it would be nice if we could get there through sort of secular, rational reasoning.
I think so. I mean, Heather McDonald, my friend, I had her on the podcast. She's a conservative, but secular conservative. So she's an atheist, which is pretty rare, a rare species in America. But her argument about this whole thing we're discussing is that the norm shifted from like the days in the 50s and early 60s, say, or any time before that, when the default position for women is on a date, I'm not having sex with you. And so the guy understands, okay, we're not having sex. Now, you can try to talk me into it. You can wine and dine me. You can charm me. And, maybe I'll change my mind. And, so you get a little bit of that tension on a date or something like that. She says the new norm now is we're going to have sex. That's it. It's great fun. Everybody's hooking up. It's the hookup culture. And now if the woman decides she doesn't want to have sex with a guy, she has to talk him out of it. Like, it's now the burden is on her to explain to him why the answer is no and justify it. And that's much harder to do, particularly with horny guys, in the midst of whatever you're necking and kissing and it's kind of building up and you think, I don't want it to go any further than this. That's hard to do with a pushy guy.
Yeah. And so you can see why in this instance, if the guy is operating out of fear as well, that's a good break. I guess, there's kind of carrot and stick and perhaps not the right metaphor, but in this case, it's probably useful for a guy in the back of his mind to think, well, I could end up in trouble here if I don't
Right.
respect what's going on here. But I think we're living through kind of fairly seismic times in gender relations. Things are, the old norms are disappearing and things are being recast very quickly on for men, for women, for however you define your gender. You can define your gender in multiple ways now.
Yeah.
And sexuality. And in some ways that's great. You've got more freedom than ever before not to be defined by your gender and the stereotypes or fit into a neat sexual box. But it's also pretty confusing. So I think, we're, having had a fairly long period of gender stability, it feels like we are going through tumultuous times. I guess my plea is, whilst going through these times, let's not dump on men because we feel it's their turn. Let's try and bring out the best for men and women at the moment, and they're not mutually exclusive. If you've got a guy in your life, you want him to feel like he's got meaning and purpose. He's going to be happier to be around. He's going to drink less. He isn't going to. He's probably going to be less violent. He's going to be probably going to be more loving father. And likewise, if you're a guy and there's a woman in your life, make sure that she can be as happy and successful as possible, and that she's getting paid the right amount and has all the opportunities, and she's going to be happier and a better partner as well. So it's how can you get the kind of win-win there, rather than just kind of being lazy and saying, well, it's not guys' time at the moment.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, that really is the central point of your book. I think you do have a chapter on paternity, marriage, divorce, child custody, and so on. I think I mentioned to you in an email, I watched that documentary, The Red Pill. It was on Netflix. Casey J's documentary, which I really liked. I thought I was going to hate it, or I thought it wasn't going to go where it did. Basically, she's a feminist who goes in with a camera crew thinking, I'm going to find a bunch of these asshole bros, but in fact discovered that there are a lot of real men's issues. For example, child custody. I mean, my parents divorced when I was 3 to 4, and my mom got me most of the time. I saw my dad every other weekend. Who in their right mind thinks that's the right formula? How was that even settled? Like, babies need mothers 80% more than they need fathers. This is insane. There's no research to support that. It was just kind of the way it was done. And then my dad had to pay my mom money every month and so on. Now I think the corrective is a little bit better, but in that film, there were guys even now talking about the child custody is still not 50-50 as the norm. Like, we should start off with 50-50 unless there's some compelling reason why the child should spend more time with one parent than the other. Yeah.
I mean, what's best for the kid, and work around that basis. I think one of the best things we can do at the moment is listen. I think rightly so, it's a time for guys to be listening to what women are saying. We've been too dominant and too bullish and abusing our power and all sorts. Not all of us. Some. So I think we should listen and hear what they've got to say, and I think women should listen to guys as well, and they might find there are things which are unexpected that you wouldn't expect a guy to say, and we probably have more emotional depth and nuance than is certainly portrayed in the media. Mm-hmm. There's been an emotional growing up, I think, where guys now, especially around mental health and certain feelings, are able to express themselves much more eloquently and honestly than before, and without feeling that makes you less of a man. So, I think we just need to sit down and talk to each other and listen and see what our own experiences are. That does sound a bit tree huggy, but I think that's
no, it's a good message. I think it's absolutely the right message. I mean, another one of these hard problems in that area, I'm not sure what the solution would be. I'm very conflicted about it, is, in a divorce, so child custody point aside, money. So, for example, I was married 20 years. In California, if you're married over 10 years, it's considered a long-term marriage, and therefore it's a no-fault. We're a no-fault state. and therefore everything is just split 50-50. Okay, you sell the house, you split it 50-50, and so on. Then there's, how much the guy makes, how much the woman makes, and then you add them up, divide by 2, and whatever the difference is, then that's the balancing difference for the monthly payments. Sure. If it's over 10 years, the payments are for life. Just imagine that you're paying, spousal support for the rest of your life, unless she gets remarried. So then there's these stories about women that just never get remarried so they can keep the checks coming. And like in my case, for example, my first wife gets 50% of my book royalties for the rest of my life, for the rest of her life. Because I wrote the books I wrote during the marriage. Okay, now when I tell my guy friends this, they're like, that's outrageous. It's like, yeah, but on the other hand, she was doing a bunch of work that isn't recognized or cataloged as earning money, raising kids, housework, and so on. How do you put a price on that? Because I recognize that. I mean, now I'm in, my second marriage with a 3-year-old. My wife does the majority of the, child care. And it is a lot of work. As I mentioned, when I'm alone with my little guy for 3 or 4 hours, I'm wasted.
Yeah.
It's like, thank God she's home. Huh. Yeah. So to go off and write an article or do a podcast, this is like free time compared to childcare. And I love being with it's just exhausting. And society doesn't put a price on that. And so has to make those adjustments. In the bad old days where, the woman would work and put her husband through medical school, and then he becomes a successful medical doctor and runs off with the nurse or whatever and leaves her high and dry, and she's got no earning power. That has to be adjusted for.
Sure.
And that's a really hard one for, the law to solve that problem with real numbers.
So do you feel resentful, or do you think that it's kind of got the balance about right?
Yeah, I think that's about right. I don't feel resentful. I mean, it's not a huge amount of money in terms of my book royalties. Someone like Johnny Carson famously got divorced like 3 times while he had the Tonight Show, maybe 4 times. Each of those wives got half the Tonight Show. We're talking tens of millions of dollars a year, or hundreds of millions or whatever. It's like, whoa, okay, I can see why those guys might be a little resentful, but.
And John Cleese has been doing his alimony tour.
Oh, yes, I heard about that. That's right. Yeah, when he was on Bill Maher, Bill made a little joke about, we like it when you get divorced because then you have to go back out on the road and be funny again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think he was kind of resentful, right? Wasn't he?
He seemed a little bitter about the whole thing.
Yeah.
I think he's going through a sort of general bitter phase at the moment. He's, I think he's a bit down on Britain as well. So,
right.
I don't know what's going on with him,
but taking the extreme cases out of the formula and just say, well, the average person, they don't make that much money, and she doesn't work and he does, and I mean, and then they end up getting divorced. It'd be better if they didn't get divorced, I guess, for the kids or whatever. But it happens, so then what? There has to be some kind of adjustments made.
Yeah, I don't know. Fortunately, most of my friends have got married late, so I haven't had to witness it. I don't know. I guess it's a case by case, and how do you draw the line? If the woman's career has been put on hold, then and being a homemaker is, as we know, a kind of full-time job, then she needs that quality of life afterwards, but not just kind of screwing the guy needlessly. And I don't know. I mean, I guess put the kid first and try and be fair. Probably varies state to state, doesn't it, with you?
It does, yes. Yeah, there's not many federal issues about it. It's pretty much state to state. Yeah, and it varies.
Yeah. So
although the no-fault divorce thing is pretty common, simply because it was impossible to determine, well, whose fault was it? Well, he had an affair. Well, she had an affair.
Yeah.
So
where would a man get off lightest? Which state?
I actually don't know.
Maybe Alabama or somewhere.
I've never actually. I only cared about California because that's where I live. And the California law, I think it's pretty fair, with the exception of the extreme. Well, I mean, the second richest person in the world now is Jeff Bezos' ex-wife, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose so. Washington has the same laws as California in that sense, split everything 50-50. That does seem, crazy, but whatever, that's the law. And there's reasons why it came about that way. So, guys complain about the extreme versions of that. But again, in that Red Pill documentary, a lot of their complaints, I could say, yeah, okay, that's a legitimate complaint. particularly the child
Yeah.
custody thing.
Yeah, I think childcare is the big, it's where, I mean, that's something I've come across a lot, is where guys cannot get access to their kids. They want to be good dads. We are,
Yeah.
in this generation, we've evolved. We've become hands-on, emotionally present dads. We've gone from the days where in the 1970s, dads would spend 5 minutes quality time a day with their kids.
Right.
There was nothing, So it's heartbreaking. I have a friend at the moment who, for various reasons, cannot get to sleep with any sort of meaningful amount of time, and it's devastating. He wants to be the dad. He wants to be there and in his kid's life, and he can't, and that's awful.
Yeah.
That's awful. So, that really needs sorting out.
Yeah. Well, Tim, I think we've hit all the major topics in the book. We've been going over an hour and a half. I love the your writing style is very compelling. It's really enjoyable to read.
Thank you.
And so, what's next? What are you working on next? Oh, your kale diet thing, right?
It's all hail kale. It's a discerning wellness podcast, which it's for the BBC, but it's on iTunes and stuff. So we're working on a new series of that. I don't know. What would you? Maybe we should do something. Is it, as an arch skeptic, is there any sort of wellness that you're open to?
I don't know. You should do something on atheism and the rise of secularism. And I've been having a few podcasts about this because the rise of the nuns. There's more and more people. They're not necessarily atheists, but they're not religious. So they want to fill that with something. I just had a philosopher on who has a book on Epicureanism as a modern ethical worldview that's worth adopting. Another friend of mine has one on Stoicism. My friend Deepak Chopra, he's got a huge following, and it's kind of a modern American Buddhism worldview.
Yeah.
I think there's a need for replacing religion with something that gives people meaning. It gets back to what you were talking about. We're a social primate species. We need community. We need our, fellow people to hang out and do stuff with. Religion has traditionally played a lot of that role. And what's going to replace it if those trends continue, particularly in Europe? Then there's no religion, or the cathedrals are all turned into art museums and music concert halls, which is great. But then what? I think maybe that's another project.
Absolutely. And there's some research showing that if you go to church, synagogue once a week, you live 7 years longer.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Well, I've deconstructed some of that. A lot of that has to do with, it's not like belief in God makes the difference. It's the social aspects. So,
Exactly.
for example, an atheist married to a religious person gets the same effect.
Yes.
They go along to the church or synagogue, they donate to charities, they participate, and they get the benefits. It comes down to a practical thing of having people that care about you to remind you, don't eat steak every night, don't have the cheesecake, don't forget to take your vitamins, go to the doctor. Yeah. And religious people, engage in less unhealthy diets and smoking and risky sports and risky sex and things like that. So that's where those numbers come from.
So we need a religion for cynics.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. That's right. Yeah. Cynicism. There's an ism for you.
Well, I feel like that's the national religion in Britain at the moment. So
it is.
Yeah.
What's going to happen with Brexit? It's coming up.
I mean, today it was announced that they're going to shorten the amount of time that Parliament. It sounds like we've entered a constitutional crisis today. They're trying to shorten the amount of time that Parliament's got to discuss Brexit. I honestly don't know how it's going to turn out.
So is Boris something of a alpha male kind of Trump-like character, appealing to the kinds of guys we've been talking about? They want a strong male.
He doesn't project machismo in the same sense that Trump tries to, though he has certainly had a fairly fruitful sex life. I think traditionally he's kind of cut across class and socioeconomic boundaries because he was because of character and charisma. And he was the kind of affable toff. And perhaps we're wired to like toffs in this country, which is how he got elected to be London mayor twice. London's a very sort of left-leaning cosmopolitan city. I don't think he'd get that now. I think in the last couple of years, he's moved to the right and he's certainly backed Brexit to the hilt. I think if you look at the Brexit demographics, very, very similar to Trump supporters. It was a lot of those economically left behind areas who wanted to put two fingers up the system.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you express it? You express it with a very destructive vote.
Mm-hmm.
The irony being that those people are probably going to be very affected by this, if car plants shut down or the economy tanks. But it is that sort of self-destructive streak. It's the two fingers up to the system, and a really similar demographic to Trump. It's kind of it's an eerily similar sort of response, and it happened a few months before Brexit. Was before Trump. I don't know. I honestly don't know what's going to happen. It feels like we're driving towards the edge of the cliff at the moment, and I don't know which way it's going to go. Or maybe the European Union are going to blink and offer a deal that will get through Parliament. But it feels like both our countries are having
it's not like these young men we've been talking about can look at these leaders and think, well, I could be like that. Because they're not going to be like that. I mean, Boris went to Eton, right? This is like one of the most exclusive elitist schools that almost nobody gets in. Trump lives in this gold-plated home in a high rise in New York. Most people are never going to live like that. So there's something else, the swag or that they have or exude, or something that these young men like.
Yeah, I don't know if Boris has. I mean, I don't know if he has the young male appeal that Trump does. I think it's more the appeal of, I'm going to be macho on Brexit, and get Brexit across the line. But he's not been elected prime minister, so
right.
It's hard to know what his popular supporters, and we've got a fairly unpopular opposition leader at the moment as well. So it's hard to know exactly how popular he is.
Right.
But I think Brexit perhaps channeled some of that male anger. More men voted for Brexit than women, and it was those kind of depressed areas that were more likely to vote than the affluent areas. So I think the kind of Brexit vote and the Trump vote align. I don't know if young men across the nation are waking up saying, I want to be an Etonian toff. Maybe they are, but I've yet to meet them.
Right, that's funny. All right, Tim, thanks for coming on the show. Congratulations on the book. Keep up the good work. Very interesting.
Thank you.
All right.
All the very best.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.